Mm-hmm.
I'll start the PowerPoint after everyone's had a chance to be introduced, I think.
Okay, very good. Then you start us off, right?
All right, sounds like a good idea. So good afternoon or evening to those of y'all joining us from London and Hungary and Israel and all over. My name is Cindy Seaton Rogers, and I'm the Academic and Outreach Events Manager at the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at UT Dallas. It's my pleasure to welcome you all today for this very special event. First, I wanted to go over a couple of quick housekeeping items. Everyone's muted and should stay muted. If you don't mind, go ahead and stop sharing your video though, so that we can maximize the feed for other presenters. We are going to be having a question and answer period at the end. So while you're thinking of those, if you'll just type them in the chat, we'll get to as many as we can there at the end of the event. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Romer, Dr. Niels Romer, who is the Interim Dean of the School of the Arts and Humanities and the Director of the Ackerman Center and the Stan and Barbara Rabin Professor of Holocaust Studies here at UT Dallas. He received in 1993 his MA from the University of Hamburg and in 2000 his PhD from Columbia. He has published numerous articles, books, and several co-edited volumes and is the co-editor of the Germanic Review. His special fields of interest are the Holocaust, human rights, German and Jewish cultural and intellectual history, and today he'll be talking with our special guest speaker, Robert Ratony, who will be introduced in just a moment by his wife, Eva, who we are particularly thrilled to have with us as she is a UTD alumna from 1976. Forgive me for putting that year out there. We were very fortunate to have them with us here on campus back in March during the 50th Annual Scholars Conference when they presented the Mitchell L. and Miriam Lewis Barnett Lecture, and we're thrilled to welcome them back and to have Robert give us the rest of his story now that his memoir has been published. So Eva, if you don't mind, go ahead and introduce him.
Well, my name is Eva Ratony, but I have more than my name in common with today's speaker, my husband, Robert. I am also a child Holocaust survivor. However, I was too young to remember any of the horrors of the Holocaust. I also grew up under the communist regime in Hungary and was 13 years old when my parents decided to flee after the failed 1956 uprising. My parents, my younger sister, and I managed to make it across the border to Austria on our third try. As my husband, we were too late as well to get permission to immigrate to the United States and stayed in a refugee camp in Austria until September 1957 when we left for Canada. I met my husband in 1959 when I was still a high school student in Montreal, and we got married 4 years later in Montreal. By this time, I was a rising junior at Hunter College in New York City, and he was in graduate school at MIT. Robert asked me to read his stories when he started writing them in 2003, claiming that my English grammar and composition were superb compared to his, having had 4 years of high school English, while he had only one summer course, which he managed to pass on the third try. One more thing I would like to share with you. By the time he started to write down his journeys, we were married for almost 40 years, and I thought I knew everything about him, but I was wrong. I learned much more, especially about his survival during the Holocaust as a 6-year-old child, but he never spoke about to me or to our children. He wrote his stories for our children and grandchildren, and neither of us thought that it would turn into a book published 17 years later. We are humbled to be back at UT Dallas to launch his book. As you can see, I am a UTD alumna, as one of our journeys together included my completing a graduate degree at UTD in 1976. We are excited to return to UTD and the Ackerman Center, though virtually, for a second time this year. Please welcome my husband, Robert Ratony.
That's when we can turn on all our electronic applauses to welcome him, that you could see us and our excitement. Cindy will start now the PowerPoint in a moment, and I think we're just about ready to go. Thank you first of all for joining us again. I mean, I remember still that Sunday very much when you had visited us on campus for many reasons, but one being also that was the last event that we did face-to-face in the traditional manner. It was just on the edge, of everything radically changing around us. It was at the beginning of March. Then we went into spring break and returned to online teaching. So everything very, very quickly changed. But it's my great pleasure today to have an opportunity to ask questions. I like asking questions. And I think hopefully by doing that, we all will get to know a little bit more about Robert's new book. So let me just right away get into this and ask maybe a couple of questions about the book and how this really came about, that you ended up being a speaker for many, many years and now also an author of a book. Well, let's maybe first of all, start with the cover of a book. That's always a good way to begin, and the title. I mean, in a way, your book fits, one would say, the category of a memoir, right? But in many ways, your title and subtitle and also the design of the book in many ways suggests to the reader much more. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about how you see your own book?
Yes, I'll be glad to answer all your questions, but before I do that, please allow me to thank you personally to invite us for this event. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank Holly Miori, Director of Development and Alumni Relations, as well as Amal Shafek, a PhD candidate and research assistant at the Ackerman Center, for their fantastic support in logistics and organizing this affair. To come back to your question, yes, I would like to mention a couple of what I would call overarching conclusions I reached from my 5 journeys that are not necessarily explicitly stated in my book. One is the reality of the human condition. I did a lot of research and some soul searching when I wrote these stories, and subsequently, many years later, when I put them together into a book, I came to the conclusion that the humans have not changed in hundreds of thousands of years since we appeared on this earth. I concluded there is good and evil in every human heart, and there is only a thin line that separates the two. I have witnessed both evil and good during the Holocaust, living under communism, during the bloody uprising, Hungarian uprising of 1956, as a refugee in Austria, and as an immigrant in Canada and in the United States. I believe that such evils as racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, Nazism, xenophobia, and other evils are sicknesses of the heart and the soul, and there will never be a medical or social cure for them. I concluded that the only way to protect the weak and the minority is through laws made by men. That is why I took the risk to escape Hungary and live in a free society where laws and not dictators rule over men. The second conclusion I came to is that it doesn't matter how you start out in life, rich or poor, physically or emotionally hurt, one parent or two. With determination, hard work, some family support, a few mentors, and some good luck, you can set your goals and prepare yourself to be a successful and a decent man. The 5 journeys of my book during 26 years of my early life are a testament to that.
Thank you. Eva already mentioned that you had a very specific audience at first in mind, meaning your grandchildren, and that's also what you mentioned in your introduction. Could you say a little bit more about what motivated you originally to write this book?
Yes, I always had a kind of a latent desire to write down a few important and what I thought were interesting stories of in my midlife, even before we had grandchildren. But I never got around to do it. I was just too busy working hard and actually living the American dream. Then our grandchildren were born in 2000 and 2002, and I decided to write my stories for two reasons. First, to acquaint them with their Jewish Hungarian roots, and second, through 5 separate stories that I call journeys, I hope that I can pass on some important conclusions and lessons I learned during my early life. The idea of putting my stories together into a book and publish them did not occur to me until a little over a year ago, after I became a public speaker of my first journey titled Holocaust Childhood. During the past 10 years, I have spoken to over 10,000 of students and adults about the story. During the Q&A sessions after my speeches, I was often asked if I published my story. Students, as well as adults, also wanted to know how a 60-year-old Holocaust survivor from Hungary ended up as a well-educated and successful businessman in America. And that is when I decided to become an author and publish my journeys in a book.
That, kind of leads me into, what otherwise, I think would, right away be the next question. After all, you were trained to be an engineer and you were a very successful business executive. And then eventually you became a public speaker, delivering thousands of talks, like you said, about the Holocaust. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you transitioned from the engineer and business executive to the public speaker and now the author?
I see you've got some slides up there which are a little come too early in my speech, but I don't know who is in charge of the PowerPoint slide.
We'll just let it sit there for a moment. So
maybe we'll come to that. But let me answer your question, and if you can take the slide off because it's a little premature. This transformation I talked to you came about as a result of a coincidence or coincidences and the unintended consequence of reluctantly allowing a very close Baptist friend of mine to read my story of the Holocaust when I wrote it about 15 years ago. It was not the first story I wrote. I tried a much easier story just to try my skill at writing stories. Then this allowing my friend to read the story led directly to my first public speech at this friend's Baptist church in Atlanta in 2010. Then at that speech, a docent of the Bremen Holocaust Museum was present. And that's when I was discovered in Atlanta as a child Holocaust survivor 10 years ago. And that is how I became a public speaker on behalf of the Georgia Commission on the Holocaust, the Bremen Holocaust Museum, and other educational and civic institutions for the past 10 years. Speaking has not been easy, if only because of if it wasn't for the occasional feedback that I got from some of the students. And as a result, I continued to speak, although once in a while I decided that I should stop, but I continued to do it every year since then. I'd like to share with you a typical letter from a high school girl to show you the kind of feedback I got that gave me the courage and the energy to continue to speak. And I don't know if you have that slide available. Yeah. It's a handwritten letter from a high school girl here in Atlanta. And I don't know if you see the slides. But
here it is. There's a slight delay.
That's not the one. That's that I'm referring to. That's a slide about the high school girl wrote to me. So while somebody is looking for that, let me read the letter that she wrote to me. I think this happened about 2 or 3 years ago. It says, "Dear Mr. Ratony, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. Hearing you share your journey had a tremendous impact on me. Although I'd learned about the Holocaust before, you helped me to recognize and confront the depravity that exists and our crucial role in standing up for what is right, no matter the cost. I am grateful for the lessons I learned from you. Thank you, San Cristiana Dole." So during the past that and dozens of other letters like this I get typically during the year, and this is why I continue to speak. Every fall or spring when school is over and I'm done, I always tell my wife, Eva, that that's it, I'm done for the year and I'm not going to do it anymore. And then come the fall, do it again. So,
but
that,
thank you for sharing that with us. But now, after all, you wrote, and so can you say something about how the experience of writing your memoir um, is somehow different from the experience of you being a public speaker? You emphasize how the feedback was really important always. When you write, it can be a very lonely business. So can you say something about comparing the experience of writing to the experience of speaking?
yes, I can. Writing of the 5 stories I wrote, writing the Holocaust story was clearly the most difficult and took 2 years because of the travel to interview family members around the world who were with me during the Holocaust and still alive. I traveled to Australia, to England, to Hungary, to Israel, and Canada. Writing was also cathartic because we never spoke about it at home while I was growing up. It was taboo, and I never confronted myself with some deep-seated emotions that I didn't even realize that I had. Speaking was emotionally difficult because I discovered that the wounds of the Holocaust never healed. The images of the Holocaust are sort of frozen in my mind when I speak about them. It feels like time travel back to when I was 6 years old. And I finally conceded that I will carry this baggage to the end of my days.
Thank you. I think that is in a way a good way for us to transition now into the various journeys. And I think that's okay with you. We'll maybe start with the first journey, maybe meaning the Holocaust childhood. So I think, the Holocaust obviously had devastating effects on you and your family, and on Jewish life in Hungary in general. But in many ways, as your memoirs attest, much of the hardships of being Jewish in Hungary had started well before the Second World War, and certainly before 1944. How did anti-Semitism affect you and your family prior to the German invasion of Hungary in March 1944?
Well, there are 2 lasting impacts I can tell you about. I was born in January in the year of Kristallnacht in 1938. The riots against the Jews in Vienna, only 125 miles from Budapest, determined that I shall remain a single child, something that I regretted all my life. My mother was close to 70 years old when she confessed to me that my father forbade her to have any more children, telling her, and I'm going to quote her, says, "We cannot bring," as quoting him, her telling me what she was told, "We cannot bring another Jewish child into this world," end of quote. In retrospect, he was right. because I barely survived as a 6-year-old child. And if I had a younger brother or sister, I'm sure that they would not have been able to survive. The second event that had a lifelong impact on me was in 1942, when I was 4 years old. My father was conscripted into a Jewish labor battalion, and then I never saw him again.
Thank you for answering that question. I know this is not easy to talk about. Can you speak a little bit more about 1944? At this point, you would have been 6 years old, and it would have been mandatory for you to wear the yellow star. Could you tell us a little bit about what you remember from this and what that meant for you as a child?
I don't remember a lot, but there are a couple of things I remember very clearly that I can tell you about. The truth is that as a 6-year-old child, I didn't understand the significance of wearing a yellow star. I knew that it was strange that both my mother and I had to wear a yellow star in public, but my mother didn't explain to me why. I think she tried to protect me. Our naivety as children is best illustrated by my childhood friend whose nickname was Bundy, who was not yet 6 years old in March of 1944 when the law came that we had to wear a yellow star. He told his mother, when he saw me with my yellow star, he told his mother that he wanted to wear a yellow star just like I did, but his mother refused to sew one on his coat. He cried bitterly, and neither of us understanding, of course, that the yellow star could make a difference between life and death in the ensuing months. And that's really about all I remember about the yellow star.
Thank you. Then I think if it's okay with you, we'll move now to your second journey, growing up under communism. And that's, for many of us, also in many ways, a very, very distant world. But what is it that you remember from growing up in a working class family under communism?
It's a good question. This one I remember real well because I lived under communism for 8 years as I was growing up. I grew up in very poor circumstances, way below what we define today in the US as the poverty line. Without a father, my mother had to work as a manual laborer since she had only an 8th grade education and no special skills. We had meat once a week, rarely had butter or eggs, and lived in a 2-room tiny apartment with no indoor plumbing. I never had a bicycle or a soccer ball to kick around. My mother never had enough money to make ends meet, and she constantly had to borrow from her best friend. The Communist Party took control of Hungary in 1948, and as an adolescent, I was brainwashed with relentless propaganda about the, quote, exploitation of workers in the imperialist and capitalist West, end of quote, and the wonderful utopian future of the working class under socialism and communism. It was many, many years later that I discovered a brilliant statement by Winston Churchill that I would like to quote. He said at a White House luncheon in 1954, quote, "The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries." And believe me, my mother and I definitely shared those miseries.
Thank you. But then just, that's maybe a good opportunity to look at that again from the other side, because despite the many tragedies that you faced as a child and adolescent, you describe your childhood as a happy one. So what do you attribute this happiness? That seems to, we just heard about communism, but yet you say, all in all, you had a happy childhood. How did that work?
Yes, and frankly, when I wrote my story, I kind of surprised myself, but I came to that conclusion. And the reasons were a number of reasons. One is because my parents come from very large families. My mother was 10 and my father were 9, and enough uncles and aunts and a few cousins survived the Holocaust to provide a very loving family environment for me as I was growing up. My widowed aunts and uncles all got married after the war, and I was the only orphan in a family without a father. In addition, I had my mother's unconditional love, and I could see and truly appreciate the many sacrifices she made to make my life easier for me. Also, I was a very social boy, made friends easily, and I always had a positive outlook toward the future, regardless of our economic circumstances. I never felt victimhood or had a chip on my shoulder. Everyone around me told me that I was smart and that I will become an engineer, and I believed it. Also, I participated in all kinds of sport activities. The communist system subsidized all sports and arts. It was almost free to attend the theater, the opera, or the symphony, and my mother encouraged me to take advantage of these opportunities. And these are the reasons I felt like I had a happy childhood.
Thank you. Now, I really want to ask you a question that is, I think, a bit of a difficult one to answer, but let's just see. Of all the several influential characters you described in your memoir, if you had to choose one that you think is the most influential one of the many that you're describing, who would that be?
Well, I actually had two that I like to talk about. The first one, the most important one, was probably my mother's older brother, Uncle Lotzi, who became my role model. He provided the much needed guidance during my teenage years. He chastised me if I got into trouble, constantly reminding me of my responsibilities to help my mother, and instilled in me an unquestionable desire to become an educated man. One of his favorite saying, and I quote, says, "Robert, always remember that they can take away everything from you, but not your education." End of quote. He never defined who they were, but I instinctively understood it. My other mentor was Rabbi Kalman, who officiated my bar mitzvah when I became 13. The impact of his guiding words I never really fully appreciated until much later in life. To illustrate his role, I like to read my own translation of the letter he gave me with his present of a Hebrew Bible, the only present I got at my bar mitzvah. And I'm going to read it for you, and this is what you see on the screen now on the left side in Hungarian in his handwriting. It says, "My son, let this prayer book be your life's guide and source of strength. My first advice, try to recover from the wounds inflicted on you. Do not brood over the past. Become a man of sound mind, sound heart, of strong will and action. Your challenge will be how to accomplish that. Listen to my second advice for the road you will travel. Depend on yourself to make up for what the mad devastation of the evil years deprived you. A father and his advice. Depend on yourself to harden your character, to develop your own principles, to enjoy work, and to race against life's inevitable disappointments. My third advice, trust yourself. You grew up in front of me, and I know that you can be more responsible than many grown-ups can. I have known you for many years, and we like each other. Look at me. Promise me that you will always be a truly good man, an affectionate son of your self-sacrificing mother, and a devoted student of the ancient Torah. May its blessings follow your life." January 11, 1951. That was 5,711 in the Hebrew calendar, and signed Dr. Kalman, Rabbi.
Thank you. That leads me nicely into my next question, because on top of that document, you actually named Robert Reichman.
Yes.
And so in many ways, there's an interesting moment in 1956 when you changed your last name from Reichman to Ratony. And so I would like to know what motivated you, and also to understand something more about the short and long-term consequences of that name change.
Interesting story. Just before my graduation from high school, the Hungarian government issued a proclamation to encourage people with foreign names to Hungarianize their names. They made it extremely simple. You just have to pick a Hungarian name, go into an office, sign a piece of paper, and boom, you had a new name. Virtually all Hungarians with German names were Jews. In anti-Semitic Hungary, it was easy to pick out a Jew just by his or her last name. After graduation from high school, I wanted to blend into my new society at the university without letting everyone know that I'm a Jewish before I could meet anyone, before they could even get to know me. So I consulted with my mother, and she didn't object to changing my name. Another reason for changing my name was that Hungarian is a phonetic language, and in Hungary, nobody could spell Reichman correctly. I have to spell it every time, R-E-I-C-H-M-A-N-N. So that I thought that would make it easier for me for the rest of my life. The short-term consequences of changing my name came only 6 months later when I escaped to Austria, where they speak German, and nobody could spell Ratony. I never forget the Austrian border guard sitting then over his registry writing the names of the refugees who crossed the border the night before. I was standing in front of him, and without looking up, he asked me, "What is your name?" And I said, "Ratony." And for a second, I thought, maybe I should have said my old name, Reichman. He looked up and said, "And how do you spell it?" So much for never spelling my name again. The long-term consequences of Hungarianizing my name came in Canada and in the US, where nobody could spell Ratony, and is mispronounced as Ratony. Everyone thinks that I'm Italian. The picture that you see shows my high school graduation scholastic report. The principal did not have time to issue a new one with my new name, so he just erased the word Reichman, crossed it off, and wrote Ratony on top of it.
Thank you. So 1956 in many ways was an important year for you insofar as you changed your name, but it's otherwise also an important year because of the Hungarian Revolution. And so I would like you to tell us a little bit more about what would have been like for you as a college student to find yourself caught up in the middle of an uprising that very quickly turned quite violent.
Yes, very briefly. First, it was thrilling to have a taste of freedom when the uprising broke out, led by the students in my university. We had a long march that lasted almost all day, and I never experienced such feelings before. We were singing, and everybody could say what they wanted to. But soon after that, before I knew it, I had a gun in my hand, and I didn't even know how to load it and how to fire it. I frightened my mother when I showed up with a gun at home. I did not think of her feelings and the shock she would have seeing me with a gun, because it was only 12 years earlier when she was taken away at gunpoint from the very same apartment. I was very ashamed that I was so stupid and didn't think of her feelings. The students' demands for freedom at the beginning of the uprising from the Russian oppression were clear to me, though some of the other demands I didn't fully understand. Then I began to witness the hatred of the mob in lynching and burning the bodies of the enemy, the secret police that represented the iron fist of the communist leadership of the country that everybody was afraid of. I saw again what I witnessed as a 6-year-old child during the Holocaust: man's inhumanity against other men. It was sobering and made me question my own humanity. I learned that the revolutions are messy affairs, and they leave a dark shadow over your head and confusion of what is right and what is wrong.
Thank you. I think that is then also a world that we want to leave behind, and therefore you might like that as that we move to your next journey, number 4 of your book, The Escape. So in 1950, or barely still in 1956, in December to be precise, you made up your mind to escape from Hungary. In hindsight, what do you think were the main reasons behind that life-changing decisions? Were they mainly practical or psychologically, or what motivated you to make this really dramatic decision in your life?
Well, that's a good question. Certainly a life-changing event. First, there was the feeling of retribution as a, quote, counter-revolutionary. I signed my name in a book when I picked up a gun at the local police station, and that worried me. In the last second, I decided to sign my old name, Brightman, not Ratony. But then I realized that was kind of foolish because in the neighborhood where I grew up for 18 years, everybody knew who I was, regardless of what name I had. Second, there was also the desire in a free society that I have never experienced. And also, I must admit, it sounded like an interesting venture for an 18-year-old boy. And finally, I heard that 2 of my lifelong friends, one of them my neighbor in the same house where I grew up, and another one, a friend that I went to elementary school, I heard that they escaped successfully to Austria. So I talked to my mother and asked her and discussed with her my trying to escape from Hungary. And she agreed. And the deal was that I will try to escape first, and then she will follow me, perhaps using a guide, a smuggler. I didn't know at the time that I will not see her again until 7 years later in 1963, when I got married to Eva in Montreal.
Thank you. If that's okay with you, I would like now to kind of move into your final journey, your immigrant years. This is journey number 5. So after you escaped from Hungary, in lots of ways you left home behind, how difficult was it for you to find a new home country? What were the options? I mean, where you crossed to Austria and then you thought, I could go here, I could go there. So what were the options in terms of immigration, and how did you end up in the United States and to become a citizen even?
Well, this is one of my favorite stories. Back in Hungary, I heard a lot about America through the Voice of America radio station and listening to Radio Free Europe. Of course, you were not allowed to do that, so we had to pull the shades down, close the door, make sure we turn on the radio quietly so none of our neighbors could hear us. That's why America was the first destination for a friend of mine, Bill Fodor, with whom we kind of schemed how we're gonna try to escape from Budapest and go to Vienna. Unfortunately, by the time we got to the American embassy after a rather interesting but successful escape in December 1956, we were told that the quota for Hungarian refugees was filled. U.S. Congress actually passed a special quota for Hungarian refugees, and I think the number was about 30 or 36,000, but by the time we got there, it was too late. The door was closed to America. I also went to the Israeli embassy where they were recruiting young Jewish boys. First, they didn't want to believe that I was Jewish because my Austrian refugee document had a stamp on it that had the word Catholic on it. I threatened to drop my pants to prove that I'm Jewish, but they finally agreed to talk to me. They promised full tuition at the Technium, but first I would have had to spend 6 months in the Ulpan, an organization where they teach you how to speak Hebrew. And then I would have to serve 2 years in the Israeli Defense Forces before attending university. Also, I felt rather guilty to leave my best friend behind, who is a Roman Catholic, so I declined that opportunity. Bill and I found out that there were other countries that were actively recruiting students. These were Australia, Sweden, and Canada. We struck Australia off the list because we heard, even back in Hungary, that there were not enough women in Australia. And you have to remember, we were 18 years old, healthy boys, full of testosterone, and women were in our mind. So we crossed Australia off our list. The next, we looked at Sweden. Sweden looked attractive because they promised us full scholarship, and because we heard that they had beautiful blonde women there. Unfortunately, the Swedes wanted us to sign a 10-year contract to work in Sweden after graduating from college. This quid pro quo did not appeal to us, so Sweden was struck off our list. And that is how we ended up as immigrants in Canada in February of 1957.
Thank you. Like for all the places in the United States, you also write quite a bit about a place with 3 letters, MIT. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you ended up there?
Yes, I can. This was purely unintended consequences in 1961. At that year, after 4 years of evening engineering studies, I was about to finish, and I was looking forward to transfer to daytime to finish my engineering degree at McGill University in the fall. Then, out of sheer curiosity, another Hungarian immigrant of mine, Peter, who was in the same classes with me, he and I asked our physics professor at Sir George University, which are the best engineering universities in the United States. He said MIT and Caltech, neither of which we ever heard of. But as a kind of like a bravado, Peter and I decided to invest $10 to send our transcript to MIT in the spring, and then completely forgot about the affair. In July, surprisingly, we both received a letter telling us that we were accepted at MIT as juniors. I remember feeling that my heretofore brilliance is finally recognized, and I threw the letter into the wastebasket. I never seriously considered going to MIT. Tuition was $750 a semester in 1961, and we each had approximately $1,000 saved during the last 4 years of hard work, just enough for the next 2 years at McGill University in Montreal. And that's what we were planning to do. But fate intervened again. My future father-in-law was visiting in Montreal from New York, and I told him about the MIT acceptance. When he heard about it, he got more excited than I was and implored me to at least go to MIT and talk to them. He even offered to give Peter and me a ride in his 2-door red 1960 Corvair. I'll never forget. We had no idea that Cambridge, Massachusetts is a 200-mile detour from New York. We've never been in the United States before. But off we were. And we went to Cambridge, MIT, and met with the admission officer. And we told him our sorry saga of how little money we had. And we weren't sure if we could afford to go there. But Dr. Chambers, I think his name was, he assured us that nobody ever left MIT because they couldn't afford it. We were told that we can get loans and scholarships if we got a 3.5 average for the semester. So let me just finish the story by telling you that this was the most nerve-wracking 10-hour train ride home back to Montreal that Peter and I had. There was no way we could rationalize the risk of going to MIT. We would have to compete with the smartest students in the world, lose our money, and possibly lose our scholarship at McGill if we failed at MIT. So we sat down and wrote down the pros and cons and debated it on and on and on for hours. And finally, as we were nearing Montreal, I told Peter, not in so many nice words, the heck with it, let's risk it. And that is how we ended up at MIT.
Thank you for sharing that story with us. There's obviously one last question that I know everyone will ask, so I just want to jump ahead, and that is your relationship with Eva, which is a very inspiring love story. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the two of you met and what made you decide to follow her after years of lost contact?
Well, I knew you were going to ask me this question.
Yes, I think everyone is asking that question.
And I'm well prepared since I didn't want to get into trouble. We met on a blind date in Montreal. I was doing a favor for a friend of mine. And what upset me was after the date we had, that he didn't tell me or share with me the information that Eva was not even 16 years old. At the ripe old age of 21, I considered myself a mature man, and dating a minor was certainly beneath me. It was not love at first sight, but as we started seeing each other, and I surprised her later on with 16 red roses on her 16th birthday. And I'm sure that I made a good impression on her parents. I discovered that we had a lot of shared background and that she was a very smart person, and our relationship grew as we got to know each other better. Then we got separated when she finished high school in Montreal and followed her parents to immigrate to the US. And I started studying she started studying at Hunter College in New York City at the same time when I went to Cambridge to continue my studies at MIT. We saw each other a few times between 1961 and 1963 when I finally decided to propose to her when I was in graduate school. I think I came to the conclusion that this is the girl that I wanted to spend the rest of my life as a husband, as a friend, and the father of my children. And that's the true story.
Thank you for answering that question. I know anybody else would have wanted to ask that question, but I thought I'll go first. So we have now a little time left to take additional questions. So what I would suggest, if you have some, why don't you type them out in the chat function, and then I will pick them hopefully all up and relate them. I know there are already a couple of them in the chat, so I'll work myself a little bit backward. There's one question in between that is just curious. How did you travel to Canada? Did you travel by ship? And if so, do you remember the name of the ship?
Okay, well, I was lucky. The Canadians were very aggressively trying to recruit students who already could prove that they finished high school or they were university students like I was. And as soon as you signed up with the Canadians, they took us and to a small, provided special provisions for us in Vienna, and told us that they are going to flew us to Canada as soon as an airplane was available. So we spent maybe 2 months or 3 months in a cloister, living right in the center of Vienna. It's district number 1, and I still remember the friars who were lived there. They emptied their dining room and they put down rubber mattresses on the floor, and there was a potbelly stove. It was one of the extremely cold winters in 1956-57, and that's where we spent the next couple of months. And finally, the word came that they got an airplane and they were going to flew us to Montreal. And that's what happened. So luckily, we didn't have to wait months for a ship, as Eva and her parents had to do while they were in Austria. And the only thing that remember, I shall never forget that we finally got off from the Schwerhat airport, and my friend talked me into sitting in the very last seat. He said, "Oh, that's the safest place to be." And of course, as soon as the plane took off, I got really sick, and all I could see was the flames coming out of the engines. And unfortunately, what happened is that the plane had to turn around because the pilot discovered that one of the engines actually caught fire. So we turned back, we were back in Austria again, and then it took a couple of more days before we finally took off and ended up in Iceland as the first stop. And then after that, we ended up in Montreal, our final destination. So that's how we got there.
Thank you for answering that question as well. And let me just see. There was earlier another good question, and that is at the time when you started writing your memoirs, did you ever consider writing rather a novel based on your experience, or were you always right away set to pursue this rather in the, I mean, you did real research. I mean, this is, you know, a lot of hard work that you put into this to make sure that all the facts were correct and double checked. But did you ever consider writing rather a novel that would have given you also opportunity maybe to write about things where you didn't have memories or good documents, but that might have been really important to you?
No, one of my favorite literary forms is the short novel, short stories. I always loved short stories. And when I sat down, I made a list of what I thought would be the truly interesting stories to tell my grandchildren. And I decided to write down these stories as individual stories, each of them with a beginning and an end and something to tell in between. And I didn't even write them chronologically. I started with a sub-chapter of one of my stories, which is how I got to MIT, because I knew that was going to be fun, easy to write, and I wanted to test my skill at writing. So I had no intention of ever producing a book. I just wanted to have these 5 stories that I thought that when I'm done, I'll leave this behind for my grandchildren. So that's really, and I have plenty of time, there's no rush, and I wanted to do well with these stories. I did a lot of research, as you mentioned. It's sort of my tendency, and my wife knows this more than anybody else, that I tend to be a perfectionist, and once I decide to do something, I always feel like if it's worth doing something, then it's worth doing well. And I spent a lot of research to make sure that my stories, and really, it wasn't much of a memoir. I wanted to write a historic narrative that surrounds my story so that it would be more interesting to read, because many memoirs tend to be kind of boring after a while. And I always felt that the messages that I wanted to deliver were perhaps more important than my personal experiences. In other words, the context of my story was extremely important to me, that it be well articulated and well supported by research.
Thank you, which reminds me of the most obvious, that what we're doing today is a book launch. And therefore, I will now put into the chat function the link to Amazon, where you can actually see that the book is out. The paperback edition is in perfect mint condition. The first review has come in. It's a 5-star review. So if you buy the book, don't go below that. Just keep it right there at the 5-star mark, which is a nice way to be. And I learned that the digital version, the ebook, is currently still a little bit, corrected here and there. They're just aligning a couple of pictures. So if you just hold off from downloading the ebook just for a little bit longer until that version is perfected, I think then you will find it more rewarding when you do. In the meantime, however, the paperback is already out there, ready to be ordered in sufficient numbers for anyone who is interested. So I think I have the link here and you can pick it up right there. Otherwise, the we're open for more questions. If you have any more, please, by all means, put them into the chat function, and I will pick them up as we go on.
Can I also make a comment, Dr. Romer? Anybody who has a question afterwards, who didn't have time to perhaps send a message, but if anybody wants to send me an email and ask me a question, I'd be more than happy to answer that. So
Wonderful.
Email address someplace, maybe you can provide it to the audience.
Yes, or if, otherwise you can always, direct the questions at us, and then we forward you all emails that we are receiving. That's maybe also another way of going about it. Either way. But we are happy also to share, obviously, your email with everyone who would like to have it. So we have a little bit more time left here in case anybody has a question. This has been obviously a tremendous opportunity. It was a lot of fun having you around in March, to be honest. I enjoyed that very much. We were able to eat, to walk, and do all kinds of things. But this has actually worked out really well, and has been a wonderful experience for me. So thank you already very much on my behalf for having come and given us a little bit of your time to give us a chance to learn more about your experiences. There are lots of thank yous that are coming in now from left and right, also from the audience, who's very much appreciating you being out here. Cindy has also already shared her email, so you can also, if you want to, direct any more questions to her, and then she will relate them. And the thank yous are coming in. One of the things that we learned, which is kind of fun, if you look at it, you have like this reaction thing, and we can all give him applause at the same time, where all our clapping electronic hands are out there all at once.
Thank you.
So there's, I think, much appreciation here from all of us. I think in the end, what remains for me to say is, again, thank you all for coming. I know that some of you are almost already ready to go to bed, and will be happy now that they've, had an opportunity yet to learn something more just before. For others, the day still has a couple more hours of adventures left. In the meantime, please make sure that wherever you are, stay safe. Don't get too close to people. 6 feet is a good distance. And wear your mask and tidy up your hands. And hopefully at some point, we'll see each other soon again in the flesh, in person, on campus, or wherever we can meet again. Thank you all for being here. And thank you so much, Eva and Robert, for sharing your time with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.